Seven Blue Skies channel presents Paranormal, Book 2, Part 1, Legend of the Caller, by Dr. Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq. Introduction. Name, Dr. Rifat Ismail. Age, 66 years. Occupation, retired professor of hematology in a fair number of universities in Egypt, Europe, and the United States. Marital status, single. I have lived a full life, searching everywhere for the legends we inherited from our ancestors, and the traces of these legends stirred our horror just as it did theirs. I have faced Count Dracula and the zombie. I have entered the castle of Dr. Frankenstein. I have been exposed to the Pharaoh's curse. I have played the tarot cards, and much more. And before my time is up, or I develop dementia and lose my memory, I prefer to write my stories so that the youth will know what kind of a warrior I was against these myths in my lifetime. And today, I will tell you my bitter story of the old Egyptian village horror, the demon caller. And I'll only tell it once, but only read these pages during the day and amongst your loved ones. The night and loneliness stir the imagination, which I know well because I have suffered from it like no one else. And therefore, and for that reason only, I ask you not to read these pages alone at night. Wait for the sunlight and the warmth of human company. I have advised and warned you. 1. The Return. Finally, my village. My old sweet village where I spent my childhood and teenage years before moving to Cairo to study medicine and live there. Nothing has changed. The adobe houses, the watering cans, the mosque, its walls old and damaged, the placid lake, the curved palm tree near the walls of the village school, the barefoot, snotty-faced children playing their primitive games. I am in a taxi, one of those ancient cars which are useful for one thing only, to fall into the lake with their passengers of miserable farmers. My car would have difficulty taking this bumpy road, so I left it in Cairo. Sitting next to me is a doubtful old farmer, his lips moving the whole time, repeating Quranic verses. And every 3 minutes he shouts to the driver, "Go easy, Saleh. Why are you in such a hurry? Slow down. The world isn't ending." The driver laughs rudely and raises his voice, singing badly. In those days, cassette players in cars were not common. And he speeds up even more. And on the sides of the road, the farmers stop their work in the field, squinting their eyes against the dust and sweat to see what's happening, asserting their right to interfere in others' business, until someone clever says, "That's Saleh," and another one answers, "He's back then," and they return to their work, and the old man continues reciting Quran. Finally, my village. One of the villages of Shar'ea Governorate, a short distance from another village called Fa'us. And the name of my village is Kafr Bedr. Do you know of this name? I don't think so. Will you remember it? I don't think so. Just another of the similar sounding names in this rural area. No one cares or even knows about it except its inhabitants. From this small village I became a well-renowned professor of hematology and an invitee to nearly every hematology conference in the world, and a friend to all the hematologists on earth. I'm not being arrogant. It's just a statement of how this poor, humble village has been a springboard for my success, and I'm honored to call it home. And today, after having long avoided it, I return to this village, feeling the same need a tree has for its roots. The curious looks of children following me, and pretty teen girls sneaking sidelong glances at me and then elbowing one another playfully. Practically no one remembers me. No one. And I reached our family home, the sweet home where I had spent my best days. And like most village houses, it is made of adobe. At the entrance sits a built-in concrete bench and an old scratched kerosene lamp. Then the massive wooden door. And in the yards, ducks and chickens amuse themselves by picking up insects from the muddy ground. And a room to the right for the one entering. An ancient oven and the old carved steps leading to the roof stacked with hay and bricks of manure drying in the sun. And adjoining that, my room. And, of course, electric power had not yet reached my village. At the door I cleared my throat to announce my presence and then entered to find a small goat staring at me in surprise. An old lady sat nearby, in front of her a big copper basin filled with rice, which she was cleaning, and next to her a pretty but tired young woman washing a stark naked child. The old lady lifted her sunken eyes and saw me. "My son, Rifat." "Mom," I exclaimed as I threw myself into her hug and kissed her hands eagerly. The dear, veiny hands. The young woman grabbed me from behind, teary-eyed, and hugged me, her hands still wet. "Brother," she cried. What kindness, and what sweetness! Never in my life had I been met with such sincere kisses without something asked in return. Not from any woman except for my mom and my sister. And never did a human cry sincerely upon seeing me, except for these two dear ones. But never before had I realized the amount of poverty and misery in which they lived, as the telltale signs had always been there, but taken for granted in my view. I guess my absence here made me realize it was my duty to provide more financial support. I was now able to build a new brick home for them, and provide them with more well-deserved conveniences. But something in my mother's eyes compelled me to avoid thinking about that. Her sensitive nature would not accept this suggestion as just a kindness to my family. Actually, she would take it as an air of snobbiness toward my environment. The idea of my living alone in Cairo and traveling abroad a lot had never left her, and she remained unshaken in her belief that surely I had changed, and she waited for the first sign of me breaking her heart. So yeah, let's delay that talk for now. My return, unfortunately, was a bad sign for the birds around our home. My sister made a huge, bloody massacre, and a huge feast was prepared with my mom running the operation, like a general who knows exactly how to win a battle. May God have mercy on her. How active and resilient she was. And sitting like Haruna Rashid at a low table stacked with meat, skim milk, bread, and pies, I realized that I would have to eat all this. Otherwise, I would break their two dear hearts. And, like every Egyptian mother, any time she saw me, my mom believed that her son's health was not okay, and believed that eating is the only sign proving he was in good health. Plus, she felt, of course, that I was extremely delayed in marrying. "How I wish to feel reassured about you having a wife," she said. "She's the one who will know how to take care of your health and your food." Ah, what a sad refrain! At that time I had begun to feel lonely, with that age-old instinct a person feels, wanting to be a couple, then 3, and then 4. My heart was no different than the doorman's, or the plumber's, or the newspaper seller's heart. That pressing need for a companion who awaits your return at night, and says goodbye to you when you leave for work in the morning. May God have mercy on your soul, Mother. What if you knew, or if I knew, that I would reach the age of 66, still lonely? I did not expect to see all that I had seen, and I had spent the flower of my youth among vampires and beasts, until I had no time or emotional space allowing me to find a sweet girl to share my life with me. I swallowed the piece of meat I was chewing and mumbled, "May God make it easy," and I looked at her kind, friendly face. What if she knew what I had been through in England and Romania? If she knew, she would die from horror, and she would have made me a promise to stay with her safely until one of us died. Pinching my nephew's cheeks, I asked, "How is your husband, Raifa?" "He's doing okay. He'll be back tonight." I dipped a small piece of bread into the fresh cream and tossed it into my mouth, and then continued my checkup. "And how is Rida?" Rida, in case you don't know, is my brother. He is a farmer who preferred to remain in our village and take care of the land, living with his wife on the other side of the village, because his wife is a nervous type and rather snobby, and did not want to live with my mother and sister. Uneasy moments passed, and I realized that none of them had answered my question. "I'm asking you, how is Rida?" I noticed the distant gaze in my mother's eyes, and a tear frozen in my sister's eye as she tried valiantly to ignore the question, busying herself with feeding her child. "What's happened?" I asked again. "Mom, what happened?" Finding no escape from answering my question, My mom looked into my eyes and said softly, "May God protect and keep him." What? Is he sick? Is he involved in some kind of problem? His wife, Nagah. Don't blame her, son. It's God's will. Okay, I said, but what happened? My sister stood her son up from her lap and whispered, "Rida has been called by the caller." 2. A new legend. The caller? I exclaimed. Oh, the memories this word stirred in me. My grandmother's stories she would relate to us as children, our eyes and mouths wide open. The story of that pretty young girl who walks in the fields at night, calling the youth, the males, of course, to follow her. And a young man hurries into her hug, and only then does she reveal her true self, a horrifying, vicious ghoul who devours the guy, who is never heard from again. How much did that story keep us awake at night? And how much did we imagine its heinous details in so many terrifying imaginings? And even after all these years, I remember the raspy, low voice of my grandmother repeating the sad song. "Where is the boy, Mama?" "He forgot his family. He left the town when the ghoul called him out." And, "Where is the boy, kids?" "The boy has been charmed. He followed her, traveling to some other place." And still the years pass by, and today the story reemerges from the posterior lobes of my brain. And how strange that it comes back now, especially involving my brother. Do you mean the caller?" I now asked. "The demon caller who calls out to the youth?" "Yes, the best of the youth." Putting my next bite down on the low table, I stood up, upset, saying, "What do you mean with this nonsense talk?" With tears in her eyes, my mom replied, "I swear on it." "But there's no such thing." "There is, son, there is. Have you forgotten your grandmother's stories? Or have you forgotten everything since living in Cairo?" Ah, this old melody I feared yet expected. My mother reminding me that I definitely must have changed, and that I fancy myself bigger and better than all of my family's beliefs. Of course, that's not true. Nothing forces me to continue believing in the ghouls and the caller, just to prove to them that I haven't changed. "Well," I said, "how did she call him?" "She called him, and that's all," she said simply. "And where is he?" I asked. "Has he gone missing?" "He's at home, but he has changed. He doesn't talk to anyone, and doesn't eat or drink." "That doesn't prove anything," I insisted. "He's waiting for her second call, to follow her forever." What madness! This nonsense that haunted me in England and Romania, and even here in my village, where I expected to find some reprieve. I must investigate this matter calmly, without emotion. I shouldn't allow myself to shout at these two miserable women. "Okay," I said in surrender, and went on. "I want to see him. Am I allowed to do that, at least?" I went to my brother's red brick home, the door marked with red palm prints and a few phrases to prevent the envious eye. I knocked firmly at the door. The door opened, revealing my brother's wife, her face stern and snobby. And as soon as she saw me, she smiled cruelly and welcomed me coldly. "Welcome, doctor. Thanks to God for your safe travels." 3 kids played in the front yard, but they stopped their play and stared at me in curiosity as she led me inside. "Come now, children, say hello to your uncle." 2 small palms stretched forth to shake my hand, while the third child hid shyly despite his mother's scolding. I mumbled some compliments about how the kids had grown and how cute they were, and then followed her into the bedroom. And there, on the bed, he sat, Rida, my brother. He was withdrawn, hunched over, and isolated. Nightfall was upon us, making vision difficult. "Rida," his wife prompted. "Rida, your brother Dr. Riffat has come. Come on now, welcome him." He didn't reply, so she continued, "Rida, he came from Cairo especially to see you." Silence. Calmly, I sat next to him and looked at him. He wore a dirty blue galabeah, his head uncovered, and in his eyes was a lost gaze as he stared blankly at unseen dimensions. He hadn't changed much, and I could still see his resemblance to me. But what had happened to him? "Rita," I said gently, "don't you recognize me?" But he seemed not to hear me, much less know who I was. I patted his shoulder and turned to his wife, where she stood with her hands on her waist. "How long?" I asked. "Since a week ago." "And what happened?" Lighting the kerosene lamp to dispel the darkness of the room somewhat, thereby adding even more bleak shadows which made the tense atmosphere worse, she said, "We were sleeping, and then I heard a voice calling out for Rita, a woman's voice coming from the inland field. He got up, insistent on finding out what was going on. I told him, 'It's the caller, Rita. Don't go.' But he insisted on going, and this is the result." "And did he come back afterwards?" I asked. "No," she said. "So I took the kerosene lamp and went to the fields and found him standing there alone, unresponsive. I took him back home, and since then he has been like this." "And he really doesn't eat?" I asked. "Well, practically," she replied. "Sometimes I manage to force food into his mouth, like children, or like ducks, and he pockets the food in his mouth for hours without chewing." "And using the bathroom?" I prompted. "Right where he is." And suddenly, without warning, she broke into tears, the tears mingling with her words. "My man is lost. He's finished. I wish he wouldn't have gone. I wish he hadn't hurt her. What do I do? Oh, what do I do?" And in hysteria she swore at his stupidity and the circumstances that made him particularly the caller's victim. Then she cursed the caller. And then she cursed me personally because I had no idea exactly what I had to do with it, but she saw that I was somehow to blame and deserved being sworn at. Maybe because she preferred that I be in his place. In her opinion, my being intact psychologically was an unforgivable crime. And I don't blame her much. She then drew a raggedy breath and sniffled, so I sat her next to Rita and patted her arm. How strange is this woman? All these emotions hidden behind her stern, aloof appearance. She cried, "What do I do with these children he's left behind?" Actually, she really was in a bad position, because my brother truly was the man of the house in every way. He did everything and knew everything, and without him she was totally lost. "He's not dead, Nagah. He's not dead, you know." "Actually, he is dead." "He's just sick," I said, "and he'll get better." "No," she insisted. "I know the fate of those who are called by the caller. He'll stay like this for a couple weeks, maybe 3, and after that she will call him for the second time, and then he'll leave home, never to return, and no one will ever see him again." "No, no," I reassured her. "That'll happen over my dead body. No one will ever touch my brother with evil." And I stood up, determined. And I remembered her as well, so I continued, "And no one is going to hurt my brother's wife as long as I'm alive." Darkness covered the village like a heavy curtain, and the stars shone clearly in the sky, like holes in a black dress covering the universe. All of existence had grown cold and turned to a frightful dark blue. And dark faces passed by, greeting me, so I responded with confused sentences absent-mindedly. What are these symptoms? To a certain extent they are similar to the symptoms of severe depression, or an emotional shock, or some kind of psychosis with which I am unfamiliar, because I know very little about such imbalances. In those happy days, drugs were not that common, not like today, when we are quite familiar with the heinous images of drug use. Thus I kicked this thought off instantly, though I could not deny the similarity of these symptoms with chronic barbiturate use. But my brother was never the addictive type, and he was certainly never easy to fool. Is it a physical illness I don't know of? Is it an advanced state of psychosis or mania? Is he... No answers. There was one thing I knew. It was my duty to call some of my colleagues at the university to come see him, and I was sure they would find a Latin term made of at least 10 letters to name this disease, and would prescribe some pills and injections to return my brother to his former state. Yes, I knew what I had to do. 3. Drivel. Nagah stood amazed, watching the scene as her children stood nearby, clearly enjoying watching what was happening in front of them. And on the wooden bed my brother Rida lay, entirely unaware as my colleagues, medical doctors, examined every inch of his strong body. Dr. Adil Shalabi, professor of gastroenterology, measured his temperature and blood pressure. He placed his stethoscope on Rida's chest and abdomen, then shook his head, gathered his instruments, and stood up. Dr. Mahmoud El Asiyuti, professor of neurology, performed a pinprick test and checked his reflexes in several places, checked his jaw muscles, and then moved aside for Dr. Muhammad Ibrahim, professor of psychology, who began checking Rida doubtfully. He asked Nagah a lot of questions about my brother, not waiting for her answers. And has he been feeling lonely? And how is his relationship with his parents? Then it was my turn. Taking out a large syringe, I drew 10 milliliters of blood from his arm into a test tube containing an anticoagulant, and I handed my student, Dr. Alat, a long list of lab tests to run upon his return to Cairo. I then showed them outside to the yard and sat them down at a makeshift table on which stood teacups my sister-in-law had prepared. And with some embarrassment I said, "I thank you all for the hardship traveling here and all the time you spent on this." Sipping his tea, Dr. Mahmoud replied, "No need for such formalities among us, dear colleague. It's our obligation in this profession. Sugar, please." I handed him the sugar bowl and a spoon, then cleared my throat and said, "And now, have you formed any opinion here?" For a few moments there was silence, and then Dr. Adil said politely, "By my assessment, there's no problem. He's completely healthy, and his nervous system is grossly intact. These are not known psychological symptoms, but that means that if my colleagues claim there's no problem, then I can present them a true dilemma. But there must be something wrong." Lighting his pipe, Dr. Mahmoud said, "Of course, and that something has a name. To a certain extent it mimics the symptoms of depression or manic aphasia, but no one can be completely certain of a diagnosis." "So then, who can be certain?" I asked. Blowing out his foul-smelling pipe smoke, which formed a thick cloud, he went on, "Problem is, we know nothing of his baseline status before this episode, the circumstances that led to this, and we have no history except for his wife's fanciful story which lacks scientific proof." He then pointed the tip of his pipe at me and continued, "For example, would that lady disclose any emotional distress she caused him on that dreadful night? Is she aware of any financial crisis, or of his struggles or failures?" Continuing this line of talk, Dr. Adil added, "More importantly, are you aware of any medications he was taking?" Impatiently I responded, "Do you see any signs of addiction to any known drug? A drug which does not affect his pupils nor his nervous system, with no evidence whatsoever?" "And are you aware of all types of drugs?" "Well, I know at least," I said, "which drugs could be available in a village like this. And I know my brother well. He's not an addict. He doesn't even take aspirin. And he is very careful, so no one can slip something into his drink or food." "Well," he said, "then the answer is with his wife." Announcing his wish to speak, Dr. Mahmoud cleared his throat. If you want my opinion, can I be frank?" "Of course." Avoiding our suspicious glances, he went on, "I'm uneasy about this cruel, controlling woman, and I think she's playing some kind of psychological game with your brother, which led to his current broken state." Lifting my cup of tea, I replied, "But you don't know my brother. He is the man of the house, quite literally. It's just that he loves her so much and tries his best to please her." "That does not prevent her from attempting to control him," said Dr. Mahmoud. "But remember," I said, "she is now in a very bad situation herself. She doesn't benefit in any way from her husband's altered mental state, these days especially." Mumbling his thanks, Dr. Idle returned the teacup to the tray and said, "Anyway, these are just opinions. And really, we have to leave now. It's time for my clinic appointments, and we have a long trip back." "But won't you stay for lunch?" I prompted. "No," he replied, "maybe some other time." And with that, I showed them to my car in silence, and we started the long trip back to Cairo. I felt embarrassed, so I dared not be frank with them about the uselessness of their consultation, as it had only made the situation worse, and that what they had presented me with did not even justify the gas money I spent on this dreadful trip. I had put my problem in the hands of 3 medical titans, and they returned it back to me, saying it was my problem. And what a terrible feeling! Then I'm alone. Totally alone. And at the entrance of his clinic in Bab el Lut, Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim got out of the car in the midst of a sea of thanks and went inside. But then he remembered something and came back, leaning down to the car window to say, "You know what?" "What's that?" I asked. "If I were in your place, I would seriously reconsider the myth of the caller. Have you not considered that your brother might really have been called by the caller?" Distractedly, I returned to the village, and the night had drawn its curtains, bringing a darkness I was totally unaccustomed to in Cairo. Heavy, stifling darkness which made breathing difficult, and the headlights only dispersed the darkness a tiny bit. I reached my brother's home and knocked on the door. Nagah showed me in, pallor showing on her face. Eagerly she asked me, "What did they say?" I shrugged in despair and said, "Nothing. A psychological case, nothing more." "Well, didn't they give you any advice?" "Only things doctors care about," I replied. "But why do you ask?" She said quickly, with meaning, "I think this is the night." "Night for what?" "The night for leaving," she cried. "Listen to me, Nagah. We're not going over this again." "I won't say anything," she said. "Come inside and see for yourself." I followed her with trepidation as she carried the lantern, her long and terrifying shadow falling behind her on the floor. And we entered the bedroom, but did not find Rida in bed. Well then, where is he? I wondered. With a shaky finger she pointed to the window overlooking the dark inland field. And there he stood, looking steadily out into the darkness, his back to us. He didn't sense our presence at all. I drew close to him slowly and put my hand on his shoulder. He wasn't shaking. He didn't move an inch. No signs of awareness showed on him. His eyes gazed blankly, and his mute lips trembled as if he was planning something. "You see," she said, "he has been like that since the doctors left." Upset, I asked, "And what is the problem?" "He's sick, that's all." She made a dismissive sound and said, "The same thing happens to all of them. He's waiting for the second call." "Nagah," I said quickly, "there's no need for nonsense assumptions." And I retrieved my medical bag, which I had left there, and took from it an injection, and asked her for a pot of boiling water. Then I broke open an ampule of phenobarbital, a sedative. I took hold of his arm and emptied the ampule into his vein. He did not resist, almost as if the needle was entering someone else's vein. After a while, his eyelids started drooping and his body relaxed, so I looked at him, reassured, and said, "There you go." And then, to his wife, "He will sleep soundly until morning." "Are you sure?" she asked. "Of course. Even your caller won't be able to wake him." And together we helped him to the bed, and then I gathered my things, preparing to leave. She didn't ask me to stay with him, and I wouldn't have accepted if she had. Outside, darkness ruled, and the sound of the insects in the field made a steady cacophony. I shut the car door and started the engine. Is that weird sound coming from the engine or what? No, it's not the engine. This sound came from afar, from the inland fields. It was a low, tender voice, as if from a woman in pain. Slowly, emphasizing the syllables, a voice called, "Ra! Ra!" But that's not what she's saying. I turned off the engine in order to hear better. Yes, I could swear this voice came from the distant fields in which no human dares to walk at night. And the voice rose insistently once again. Rita! Rita! End of part 1.